The smell of fresh coffee wafted through the kitchen as I leaned against the counter, watching the sunlight pour through the window. It hit the hardwood floors in golden streaks, a soft glow that made everything feel warmer than it was. Melissa stood by the sink, her auburn hair catching the light just so, humming under her breath. She wore that white sweater I liked, the one that always made her look effortlessly put together. Emily and Ryan were arguing over cereal again. Emily wanted the one with marshmallows. Ryan was determined to finish the box of flakes just to spite her. Their voices bounced off the walls, shrill but familiar, like an old song you couldn't help but love. This was my life. Comfortable, predictable, wrapped up in a neat little suburban bow. But even as I stood there, holding my mug, something gnawed at me. It wasn't the noise or the cluttered counters, or even the mountain of bills waiting in my study. It was Melissa. She laughed at Emily's protest, handing her the marshmallow cereal with a shake of her head. But it was the way her eyes didn't quite crinkle. The way her laugh didn't quite reach her face. She'd been like this for weeks, maybe months. It was small things, barely noticeable if you weren't paying attention. Like how she'd sit on the edge of the couch scrolling her phone, angling the screen away from me when I walked into the room. Or how her hugs felt lighter, like her mind was elsewhere even when her arms were around me. I took a sip of coffee, letting the warmth steady me. Maybe I was overthinking. It wasn't like Melissa hadn't always been a little guarded. Even back when we first met, she had this way of keeping a part of herself hidden. I used to think it was mysterious, but now it just felt like distance. "Hey, what time's the recital tomorrow?" I asked, breaking into her humming. She turned, blinking like I'd pulled her out of a daydream. 6. You said you'd leave work early, remember? Yeah, just making sure. She smiled, but it was quick, a flicker before she turned back to the sink. I stared at her back, the smooth line of her shoulders, and wondered why it felt like we were speaking through glass. Ryan threw a grape at Emily, and she retaliated with a spoonful of cereal that missed him and splattered onto the table. Melissa sighed, reaching for a dishcloth. "Can you two act like human beings for 5 minutes?" she said, her tone sharp. The kids froze, their grins vanishing. "All right, that's enough," I said, stepping in. "Emily, eat your cereal. Ryan, stop antagonizing your sister." They muttered apologies, and I could feel Melissa's eyes on me as I crouched to pick up the fallen grape. When I stood, she was already moving out of the kitchen, her sweater brushing against my arm as she passed. No word, no touch, just gone. Later that night, I sat in my study, staring at an open folder of quarterly reports. The numbers blurred together, and I pinched the bridge of my nose, willing myself to focus. Work had always been my sanctuary. Numbers didn't lie. They didn't shift or waver or leave you guessing. But even now, the weight in my chest pulled my mind elsewhere. On the desk sat a framed photo of us. Me, Melissa, Emily, and Ryan. Taken 3 years ago, at a park downtown. I remembered that day like it was yesterday. Emily had insisted on wearing a princess dress, and Ryan had refused to smile unless I promised him ice cream after. Melissa stood between them, her arm looped through mine, her smile real, her laugh easy. I picked up the frame, running my thumb over the glass. I wondered how we'd gotten from there to this. A knock on the door broke my thoughts. Melissa poked her head in, her expression soft, tentative. "Coming to bed?" "Soon," I said, setting the photo down. She nodded and lingered for a moment before disappearing down the hall. The quiet settled in again. I stared at the reports, but the numbers didn't seem to matter anymore. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay awake, listening to the sound of Melissa's breathing, slow and even beside me. The weight in my chest felt heavier than before. I didn't know why, but the thought wouldn't leave me. Something wasn't right. I could feel it. The way you feel a storm brewing, thick in the air. It wasn't big enough to see. Not yet. But it was there, lingering on the edges of everything. Waiting. The house was quiet when I woke up. the kind of stillness that felt unnatural. Melissa had already slipped out of bed, the faint scent of her shampoo lingering on the pillow. I heard faint clinking in the kitchen, her morning ritual of unloading the dishwasher before the kids woke up. I pulled on a sweatshirt and wandered down the hall, the hardwood cool under my feet. Melissa was at the counter, hair tied back, scrolling through her phone with a small, distracted smile. She didn't hear me right away, so I leaned against the doorway and watched. "Who's got you smiling this early?" I asked, keeping my tone light. Her hand twitched, slipping the phone into her pocket before she turned. "Good morning to you too." She reached for her coffee mug, the movement quick and fluid. Too fluid. "You're up early," I said, letting the comment hang. "Lots to do." She gestured toward the dishwasher. "And someone has to keep things running around here." The jab was subtle, wrapped in her usual playful tone, but it hit anyway. I forced a smile, kissed her cheek, and poured my coffee. I wanted to let it go. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was looking for problems where there weren't any. But that smile, the way her body had stiffened when she saw me, my stomach tightened. The kids thundered down the stairs a moment later, shattering the tension. Melissa sprang into action, her voice slipping easily into its usual rhythm. Emily needed help finding her socks. Ryan demanded pancakes instead of cereal. I sipped my coffee and watched Melissa dart between them, her phone buzzing faintly from her pocket. I didn't ask who it was. I didn't need to. Later that day, while Melissa was out running errands and the kids were at school, I found myself standing in the bedroom, staring at her nightstand. It wasn't like me to snoop. I'd always prided myself on trust, on being the husband who didn't need to check up on his wife. But the unease had burrowed deep, and I couldn't shake it. Her phone wasn't there, of course. Melissa was too careful for that. Instead, I rifled through her drawer, feeling ridiculous and ashamed all at once. Nothing. Just a few old books, a tube of hand lotion, and a tangled mess of headphones. I slumped onto the edge of the bed, dragging a hand over my face. What was I even looking for? A love note. A secret second phone. I felt like a fool, but that nagging sense of wrongness wouldn't let me walk away. Then I remembered. She'd left her laptop in the kitchen. I moved quickly, heart pounding in my chest as I flipped it open. The screen blinked to life, asking for a password. Of course. But her email was open in the corner, the notification preview flashing. "Looking forward to tomorrow. Can't wait to see you. D." My breath caught, and my pulse hammered in my ears. I stared at the screen, the message burning itself into my mind. D. I didn't know what I was expecting, but something about the casual intimacy of those words sent a chill down my spine. I spent the rest of the day trying to act normal. By the time Melissa came home, I was sitting at the kitchen table, helping Emily with her math homework. She leaned over to kiss me on the head, her lips brushing my hairline like nothing had changed. "How was your day?" I asked, glancing up at her. "Fine. Busy." She set a grocery bag on the counter. "I picked up that wine you like, by the way." "Thoughtful of you." I kept my voice even, though my chest felt like it was going to explode. I didn't press. Not yet. That night, I called John. "Got a minute?" I asked, pacing the length of my office. "For you?" "Always." John had been my best friend since college, one of the few people who didn't sugarcoat things for me. He was also the kind of lawyer who could dismantle a case with surgical precision, which was exactly what I needed right now. "What's going on?" I told him everything. The message, the way Melissa had been acting, the sense that something was deeply wrong. John didn't interrupt, though I could hear the occasional rustle of papers on his end. When I finished, there was a long pause. "First thing," he said finally, his voice calm and measured. "Don't jump to conclusions. Easier said than done. I mean it, Alex. You're upset. You're hurt. But before you do anything rash, you need proof. Real proof. And if I find it." Then we talk. Until then, keep your head down. Don't tip her off. The last thing you want is to play your hand too early." I let his words sink in, my grip tightening on the phone. "Thanks," I said. "Don't mention it. And Alex, whatever this is, you'll get through it. You're stronger than you think." I wanted to believe him. That night, as I lay in bed beside Melissa, I replayed John's words over and over in my head. Don't jump to conclusions. But the message was branded in my brain. Looking forward to tomorrow. I stared at the ceiling, my chest hollow and aching. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same. The decision to hire Neil came faster than I expected. By the next morning, the idea had cemented itself in my mind. John was right. I needed proof. Real proof. If I was going to confront Melissa, it couldn't be based on suspicion. Neil was a private investigator John had mentioned before. Discreet, thorough, and a bit expensive, John had said. At this point, I didn't care about the cost. I just needed answers. I called Neil from my office during my lunch break. His voice was low and no nonsense, the kind you'd expect from someone in his line of work. "Mr. Hall, I hear you're in need of my services." "That's right. What exactly are we dealing with here?" I hesitated, my fingers gripping the edge of my desk. Saying it out loud felt surreal, like crossing a line I could never uncross. "My wife," I said finally. "I think she's seeing someone else." There was a pause on the other end. "All right. I'll need her details. Name, photo, places she frequents. Anything else you think might help." I swallowed hard. "I'll send everything over tonight." "Good. We'll talk once I have something." The call ended, leaving me staring at the blank screen of my phone. That evening, after Melissa had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table, gathering everything Neil might need. A recent photo of Melissa, addresses of her usual spots, the gym, the office, her favorite cafe. I emailed everything to Neil, my hands trembling slightly on the keyboard. When I finally crawled into bed beside Melissa, the weight of what I'd just done pressed down on me. She was asleep, her breathing slow and steady, her face soft in the moonlight. For a brief moment, I wanted to wake her up and ask her. Just ask. Was there someone else? But I didn't. Instead, I turned onto my side, staring at the darkened wall until sleep finally claimed me. Neil worked fast. 3 days later, he sent me the first report. It came with photos. Melissa at a restaurant, her hand resting on the man's arm. The man's name was David. They were smiling, leaning in close as if the rest of the world didn't exist. My stomach twisted as I clicked through the pictures. There were more. Them walking out of the restaurant together, laughing as they stood by his car. Him opening the door for her, the gesture smooth and practiced. Neil included a summary, 2-hour dinner at Bellevue. Client's wife appeared comfortable and familiar with the subject. Physical contact noted. Physical contact. The words felt like a punch to the gut. I scrolled through the email again, my heart pounding. There was no mistaking it now. David wasn't just a coworker or a friend. He was something more. Neil's next report came a week later. More photos, more evidence. This time, they were at a park. Melissa was laughing at something David had said, her hand brushing against his arm as they walked. I couldn't stop staring at her face in the photos. She looked happy, lighter, carefree in a way I hadn't seen in years. When was the last time I made her laugh like that? The thought crept in before I could stop it, bitter and sharp. Neil's report also included background information on David. Wealthy, successful, the CEO of some marketing firm downtown. Married once but divorced years ago. No kids, no scandals, just a spotless, gleaming reputation. The kind of guy who had everything. By the time I finished reading, my hands were clenched into fists. That night, I sat in the living room long after Melissa had gone to bed. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the fridge. I stared at the photos spread across the coffee table, each one driving the knife deeper. I didn't just feel betrayed. I felt erased, like my role in her life, in our family, had been nothing more than a placeholder until someone better came along. I picked up one of the photos, Melissa's smile staring back at me. The light in her eyes, the tilt of her head. I wanted to tear it in half. Instead, I set it down and grabbed my phone. "Neil," I said when he answered, "I need you to keep digging. Everything you can find on David." "You sure about that?" he asked. "What are you looking for?" "Leverage." Neil didn't ask questions. "You'll hear from me soon." I hung up and leaned back against the couch, the weight in my chest shifting into something darker. If Melissa wanted to play games, she was about to find out I didn't lose. The DNA test kit arrived in an unassuming brown box, the kind you could mistake for a delivery of vitamins or books. I set it on the dining room table, staring at it like it might explode. The instructions were simple enough. Collect a sample. Send it back. Wait. It should have felt clinical, detached. But my hand shook as I opened the box. I waited until the kids were asleep and Melissa was busy in the study. Sneaking into their rooms felt wrong, even vile, but I told myself it was necessary. Emily was first. She always tossed and turned in her sleep, so I plucked a few strands of her curly hair from the pillow without waking her. I lingered for a moment, brushing a hand over her soft cheek. She murmured something incoherent and rolled over. My heart twisted painfully. Ryan was easier. He slept like a log, one arm hanging off the bed, his face smushed against his favorite stuffed dinosaur. I collected his sample quickly, feeling like an intruder in my own home. When I returned to the dining room, I placed the hairs carefully into the test kit's labeled envelopes. It felt final, like I was signing the death warrant for something I couldn't name yet. Melissa wandered into the kitchen as I was sealing the box. I froze, my heart hammering. "What's that?" she asked, nodding toward the package. "Just something for work," I said, keeping my tone casual. She didn't look convinced. "Since when does your job involve mail-in kits?" "Since a new client wanted product testing," I lied. "Part of a market analysis." She shrugged, clearly uninterested, and poured herself a glass of water. "Don't stay up too late. You've got the big meeting tomorrow, remember?" "Right. I'll be in bed soon." She smiled faintly, a flicker of warmth, and headed back to the study. I watched her go, guilt clawing at my insides. But I pushed it down, sealing the box with tape. The next day, I mailed it off. The results came faster than I expected. I got the email late at night while sitting at my desk, the soft glow of the monitor the only light in the room. My finger hovered over the subject line. DNA results. Confidential. I opened it. My stomach dropped as I scanned the results. Probability of paternity, 0%. For both children. I stared at the words, my chest tightening until I thought I might suffocate. I read it again, hoping I'd misread, hoping the numbers would somehow change if I stared long enough. They didn't. I leaned back in my chair, the room spinning around me. It wasn't just betrayal. It was annihilation. Emily. Ryan. They weren't mine. I thought of all the times I'd held them, wiped their tears, read them bedtime stories, all the soccer games, the piano recitals, the scraped knees, and birthday parties. None of it was real. My entire world had been built on a lie. I don't remember how long I sat there, staring blankly at the screen. Minutes. Hours. It didn't matter. Time had stopped making sense. When I finally stood, my legs felt like lead. I made my way to the living room, the weight in my chest pressing down harder with every step. The family photo on the mantel caught my eye. The one we'd taken at the zoo last summer, Melissa's arm wrapped around my shoulders, the kids grinning in their matching hats. I picked it up, staring at the smiling faces of the people I thought were mine. And then I threw it. The glass shattered against the wall, fragments scattering across the floor. For a moment, I stood there, breathing hard, my fists clenched. Then I sank to the floor, my head in my hands. I didn't cry. I couldn't. The anger, the betrayal, it burned too hot for tears. But something inside me broke that night. And in its place, something darker took root. By the time Melissa came into the living room, the shards of glass were cleaned up, and I was sitting calmly on the couch, nursing a glass of scotch. "Everything okay?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "Yeah," I said, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. "Just dropped the picture frame. No big deal." She glanced at the empty space on the mantel where the photo had been but didn't press. "You sure?" "I'm sure." I forced a smile. "Just clumsy, I guess." She hesitated for a moment before nodding. "All right. Don't stay up too late." When she was gone, I took another sip of scotch, the burn settling in my chest like a second heartbeat. I'd spent years building this life. Years trusting Melissa, loving her, raising children I thought were mine. But now it was all ashes. And if I had to burn the rest of it to the ground to make things right, so be it. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, watching Melissa shuffle around the kitchen. She moved with practiced ease, sliding toast onto plates and pouring juice into glasses, like nothing was wrong, like she wasn't hiding a world-ending secret. Ryan wandered in first, rubbing his eyes and clutching his stuffed dinosaur. He climbed into the chair across from me, yawning as Melissa slid a plate in front of him. "Morning, buddy," I said, my voice even. He mumbled something incomprehensible, already digging into his toast. Melissa handed me my breakfast with a fleeting smile before sitting down with her own. Emily joined us a moment later, her hair a wild mess from sleep. She complained about the lack of marshmallows in the cereal box, and Melissa laughed softly. I watched them, feeling like an outsider in my own family. They were all so natural, so comfortable. And me, I was playing a role. The doting father, the devoted husband. But every bite of toast felt like ash in my mouth. I forced myself to smile, to laugh at Ryan's terrible dinosaur jokes. Melissa glanced at me now and then, her expression unreadable. Did she suspect? Did she know I'd seen the truth? If she did, she gave no indication. I finished breakfast and kissed Emily and Ryan on the tops of their heads before heading to my office. My mind was already turning, mapping out the next steps. If Melissa had lied about the kids, what else was she hiding? I started small. In the days that followed, I kept a closer eye on everything. I reviewed our bank statements, checking for anything out of place. At first, it was the usual stuff. Groceries, utility bills, kids' expenses. But then I found it. Small charges at places Melissa didn't frequent. A boutique hotel downtown. A fancy wine bar. Not outrageous amounts, but enough to raise questions. I printed the statements and tucked them away in a drawer. Evidence. Next, I started taking inventory of her schedule. Melissa was always busy. Gym classes, work meetings, errands. But there were gaps. Little pockets of time where she didn't mention where she'd been. When I asked casually, she had answers ready. Just grabbing coffee with a friend, or had to stop by the dry cleaners. Her tone was breezy, light. But her eyes never quite met mine. It was almost impressive, the way she juggled everything. The kids, work, me, and him. By the end of the week, I couldn't stomach the charade anymore. "Melissa," I said over dinner one evening, keeping my voice steady. She looked up, surprised. "Yeah. I've been thinking we should take a trip. Just us." Emily perked up. "Can we go to Disneyland?" "Not this time, sweetheart," I said, ruffling her hair. "Mom and I need some grown-up time." Melissa set her fork down, her brows furrowing slightly. "A trip? Why not?" I shrugged. "We haven't had much time for ourselves lately. Thought it might be nice to reconnect." Her smile was small, tentative. "I don't know, Alex. The kids, work. It's not exactly the best time." "It's never the best time." I leaned back in my chair, holding her gaze. "But maybe we should make time." She hesitated, and for a moment I thought she might say yes. But then she glanced at the kids and shook her head. "Let's talk about it later, okay?" "Sure," I said, forcing a smile. The conversation shifted, but the seed was planted. That night, I sat at my desk, the house quiet around me. The financial data I'd gathered was spread out in front of me, along with Neil's reports. The pictures of Melissa and David stared back at me, taunting. I felt the weight of it all pressing down, but there was no turning back now. I opened a new document on my computer and started typing, outlining my plan. Steps to gather more evidence, protect my finances, and eventually confront her. The plan wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. It just had to be enough. When I finished, I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. I'd spent years building a life with Melissa, a partnership, a family. And now I was dismantling it piece by piece. But I couldn't let myself feel guilt. Not yet. She'd made her choices. Now I was making mine. Melissa left early the next morning, her bag slung over her shoulder, kissing me on the cheek before heading out. I barely felt it. "Work meeting," she said, her tone casual. I watched her go from the window, her car pulling out of the driveway and disappearing down the street. Once I was sure she wasn't coming back, I grabbed my phone and dialed John. "Got time to talk?" I asked when he picked up. "For you? Always." "I need your legal expertise," I said, pacing the length of the living room. "It's time to start preparing for the worst." There was a pause, the kind where you could practically hear someone leaning forward in their chair. "What exactly are we talking about here?" "A divorce." The word tasted bitter in my mouth. John sighed. "All right. What's your situation?" I gave him the rundown. "Melissa, the affair, the kids not being mine." "Okay," he said after I finished. "First things first, you need to protect yourself financially. Start gathering documents, bank statements, tax returns, anything showing your income and assets. If she's been spending money on this guy, we can use that." "I've already started," I said, my voice cold. "Good. Next, you'll need to document everything. I mean everything, Alex. Dates, times, places, any proof of the affair you can get." "I've got photos," I said. "Texts, too. Enough to paint a pretty clear picture." John hesitated. "That's good, but we need to be careful. Illinois is a no-fault divorce state, so the affair itself might not carry as much weight unless it directly impacts finances or custody." "What about the kids?" My jaw tightened. "If they're not mine?" "Hold on," John interrupted. "That's a whole other can of worms. We'll need to get a legal determination of paternity. You'll also want to decide how you want to handle that emotionally, because it's not just about the law, Alex. It's about those kids and their future." I clenched my fist, the words hitting harder than I expected. "I know." "All right," John said, his tone softening. "We'll take it one step at a time. When you're ready, come by my office, and we'll map this out properly." I thanked him and hung up, my chest tight. The next few days were a blur of preparation. I spent every free moment combing through our finances, building a file thick enough to crush anyone who tried to challenge me. I found more hidden charges, gifts, hotel stays, even a spa day. Melissa had been careful, but not careful enough. Meanwhile, I kept up the act at home. I laughed with the kids, asked Melissa about her day, and played the devoted husband. But inside, I was simmering. Melissa, for her part, seemed oblivious. If she suspected anything, she didn't show it. She still kissed me goodnight, still chatted about mundane things like the weather and the kids' homework. It was almost insulting how easily she slipped into her role. One evening, I found myself in the kids' room, tucking them into bed. "Daddy," Emily said, her voice sleepy but curious, "can we go to the zoo again soon? Like last year?" I hesitated, the memory of that day flashing in my mind. "We'll see," I said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Ryan yawned, clutching his dinosaur. "Can we get ice cream after? Like last time?" "Maybe," I said, forcing a smile. Their innocence gutted me. They didn't know. They couldn't know. To them, I was still Dad. As I turned off the light and closed the door, I leaned against the wall, staring at the darkened hallway. For all my planning, for all my anger, one question kept circling back in my mind. What happens to them when this is over? The next morning, I met John in his office. "Here's what we're working with," I said, sliding the folder across his desk. John opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. "You weren't kidding. This is solid." "It's a start," I said. "What's next?" "Well," John said, closing the folder, "now we make sure you don't lose your shirt in the process. That means dividing assets strategically and ensuring you're not on the hook for child support." "Can I fight that?" "With the DNA results, absolutely. But you'll need to officially establish non-paternity in court." "And if I don't want custody?" The words felt heavy, but I forced them out. "That's your call," John said, his tone careful. "But be prepared for fallout. The kids might not be yours biologically, but you've been their father for years. The court will take that into account." I nodded, my jaw tight. John leaned back in his chair, studying me. "Alex, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but this isn't just about winning. It's about coming out of this with your integrity intact. Don't let her choices destroy who you are." His words lingered long after I left the office. That night, I sat in the darkened living room, a glass of scotch in my hand. The house was quiet, the kids asleep, Melissa working late again. The folder John had given me sat on the coffee table, a stark reminder of what was coming. I wasn't just planning an exit anymore. I was preparing for war. The idea to target David came as I stared at the ceiling that night, Melissa breathing softly beside me. My anger had settled into something colder, sharper. If Melissa thought she could walk away from this unscathed, she was wrong. But David? He was the foundation of her betrayal. Remove him, and the whole structure crumbled. By the next morning, I was on the phone with Neil. "I need you to shift focus," I said, pacing my office. "To what?" Neil sounded curious but unbothered, like dismantling lives was just another Tuesday. "David. I need everything on him. Where he goes, who he meets, and—" I hesitated. "Anything that could damage him." Neil's voice sharpened. "You want me to dig into his business?" "Yes. Start with the surface and work deeper. I want weaknesses, cracks, something I can use." There was a pause, then a short laugh. "You're not playing around, are you?" "No," I said flatly. "And I'm willing to pay for precision. You'll hear from me soon." Neil moved fast. Within 3 days, he called back with a preliminary report. "Your guy's clean on the surface," he said, his voice low. "But dig a little deeper, and things start getting murky. Couple of questionable deals. He's got contracts with companies that don't exactly scream above board. Offshore accounts tied to shell companies. Nothing concrete yet, but it smells bad. And his personal life. Divorced. No kids. Keeps a low profile, but he's been linked to a few women in the past. Nothing scandalous, though. Your wife seems to be his main focus these days." The words stung more than I cared to admit. I swallowed hard. "Keep digging. I want specifics, something I can use to sink him." "Understood." I hung up, my heart pounding. David wasn't untouchable. Over the next week, Neil's reports started to paint a clearer picture. David had built his empire on charm and confidence, but behind the polished exterior were shaky foundations. There were whispers of tax evasion, inflated earnings reports, and questionable loans. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a gambler, stacking the deck in his favor and praying no one noticed. I couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. The man Melissa had risked everything for wasn't the paragon of success he seemed to be. He was a fraud. One evening, I found myself staring at a photo Neil had sent. David, sitting at a corner table in a sleek restaurant, his hand resting casually on Melissa's. They looked happy, like a couple in a glossy magazine spread. My fist tightened around the edge of the paper. It wasn't just about Melissa anymore. It was about taking back control, showing her, and him, that I wasn't a man to be trifled with. I opened my laptop and started drafting an anonymous email. I addressed it to a competitor Neil had flagged in his report, a rival CEO who'd been circling David's business like a shark smelling blood. The email was simple, a tip-off about discrepancies in David's earnings reports, with just enough detail to pique their interest. I hit send and leaned back in my chair, the beginnings of a plan forming in my mind. If David's business was already unstable, I'd be the one to tip it over the edge. The next morning, Neil called again. "I've got something you're gonna like." "Go on." "One of David's contracts is with a company tied to an IRS investigation. Tax fraud, money laundering, the whole 9 yards. If someone were to let the right people know, it could open up a whole can of worms." "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Neil chuckled. "I'm saying you've got leverage. How you use it is up to you." I thanked him and hung up, the pieces clicking into place. Melissa had built her secret life on lies, but she didn't realize how fragile those lies were. And David, he'd made the mistake of thinking I'd sit quietly and take it. That evening, Melissa came home later than usual, her hair slightly mussed, her lipstick faded. She greeted me with a smile, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath my calm exterior. "Long day?" I asked, handing her a glass of wine. "You have no idea." She sank onto the couch, kicking off her heels. The office was a nightmare. Meetings back to back. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "At least you're home now." She sipped her wine, leaning back against the cushions. "Yeah, finally." I sat across from her, my own glass untouched. She didn't notice the way I studied her, the faint flicker of guilt that passed over her face when her phone buzzed, and she ignored it. Tomorrow, I'd call Neil and set the next phase into motion. David thought he was untouchable. He was about to learn otherwise. The next morning, I leaned against the kitchen counter, sipping my coffee as Melissa bustled around the house. She was distracted, her phone buzzing intermittently on the counter. Each time it lit up, she glanced at it, a faint smile tugging at her lips before she quickly silenced it. It didn't take a detective to know who was messaging her. "Big plans today?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. She paused, her hand hovering over a pile of mail. "Just the usual. Jim, a meeting at work. You?" "Same old," I said, hiding my smirk behind the rim of my coffee mug. Melissa was good at this. Smooth, confident, even affectionate when she needed to be. She kissed me on the cheek before grabbing her bag and heading out the door, waving to the kids as they ate their cereal. The moment her car pulled away, I grabbed my phone and dialed Neil. "She's headed out now," I said. "Stick close. I want to know exactly where she's going." Neil grunted his acknowledgement before hanging up. I knew he'd track her movements with the precision of a hawk. Today wasn't just about gathering evidence. It was about setting the stage. That afternoon, Neil sent me an update. "She met with him again," he said, his tone brisk. "They were at a cafe for about an hour. Didn't stay long this time. Looked more like a quick check-in." "Anything new?" I asked, pacing the living room. "Not much. Same body language. Close, familiar. They're careful not to cross any obvious lines in public." "Of course they are," I muttered. "But here's the kicker," Neil added. "After the cafe, she went to a bank downtown. Spent about 30 minutes there." My brow furrowed. "What kind of bank?" "Private. High-end. The kind that caters to people who need a little discretion." A cold knot formed in my stomach. Melissa had always handled the household finances, but a private bank. That was new. "Find out what you can," I said. Already on it. By the time Melissa came home that evening, I'd smoothed out the edges of my anger, burying it under a mask of calm. She breezed in, her hair slightly windswept, and set her bag down on the counter. "Busy day?" I asked, glancing up from my laptop. "Exhausting," she said with a sigh. The gym was packed, and work was just, ugh. She poured herself a glass of water, avoiding my gaze. I closed my laptop, standing and stretching. "You should have called me. I could have met you for lunch or something." She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the glass. "Oh, I didn't even think of it. I was so caught up in everything." I nodded, giving her a small smile. "Next time." Her shoulders relaxed, and she leaned against the counter, chatting about the kids' schedules and upcoming events. She was good at slipping back into the role of a devoted wife. But I noticed the cracks. The way she avoided direct eye contact. The slight edge to her laugh. She knew something was off. The next morning, Neil called with an update on the bank. "She's got a private account," he said. "Opened about 6 months ago. Small deposits at first. But they've been getting bigger lately. There's a pattern." "What kind of pattern?" "Looks like she's stashing money away. Quietly, but steadily. Almost like she's building a safety net." I clenched my jaw, the pieces falling into place. Melissa wasn't just cheating. She was preparing for an escape. Anything tying David to the account? "Not yet," Neil admitted. "But it's possible. She's careful, but there are ways to connect the dots if they're working together." "Keep digging," I said, my voice cold. "Will do." That night, as we sat down for dinner, I took a different approach. I acted warmer, more attentive. "Melissa," I said, my tone soft. "I've been thinking. We've both been so busy lately. Maybe it's time we focus more on us." She looked up from her plate, her expression carefully neutral. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe we need to slow down. Spend more time together. Go on more dates, reconnect." Her fork froze midair, but she recovered quickly, giving me a small smile. "That's sweet, Alex. But with the kids, work, it's just hard to find the time." "We'll make the time," I said firmly. "Our marriage is worth it, isn't it?" She nodded, her smile tight. "Of course." Emily interrupted then, asking for more water, and the moment passed. But I saw it, the flicker of unease in Melissa's eyes. She knew I was watching her more closely. The following week, I started making my own moves. I reached out to some of David's competitors, introducing myself under the guise of a potential business partnership. Subtle questions about David's practices led to knowing looks and quiet exchanges. "He's good at what he does," one executive admitted, swirling his drink. "But he cuts corners. A lot of corners." Another rival smirked. "David's built on quicksand. You just need to know where to step." I listened, filing their words away. Nail's reports had given me leverage, but these conversations offered confirmation. David's empire wasn't as solid as it appeared. By the time I left the meeting, I had a new plan forming. Melissa thought she was clever, hiding money and meeting David in secret. But she didn't realize I was 2 steps ahead. And David, he was about to learn that building a house of cards makes you vulnerable to even the smallest gust of wind. The time for subtlety was over. Melissa's lies, David's smug confidence, they'd gone unchecked for too long. It was time to start taking pieces off the board. I began with David. One morning, as I sipped my coffee and pretended to scroll through the news, I crafted an anonymous email to the IRS. The subject line was simple: suspicious financial activity. Confidential tip. I attached the documents Neil had uncovered: contracts tied to shell companies, discrepancies in reported income. Just enough to make them curious, to make them dig. When I hit send, I felt a strange sense of calm. It was like watching the first domino fall. By midday, I was on the phone with Neil. I said, "Keep your ear to the ground. I want to know the second he feels the heat." Neil chuckled. "You've got it." The second move came later that evening. I reached out to one of David's competitors, the one who described his business as quicksand. I sent another anonymous email, this time highlighting the contracts David had with the company under IRS investigation. I didn't have to spell it out. A savvy rival would see the opportunity and pounce. The effects were immediate. 2 days later, Neil called me, his voice brimming with satisfaction. David's firm just got hit with an audit. IRS agents showed up at his office this morning. Word's already spreading. Good, I said, my tone steady. And the competitors? They're circling like vultures. Heard whispers about a few contracts getting pulled. Whatever you sent them, it worked. I nodded, a cold satisfaction settling in my chest. David had built his empire on lies, and now the cracks were widening. But I wasn't done yet. Melissa had no idea any of this was happening. At home, I played the part of the devoted husband, asking about her day, helping with the kids, pretending everything was normal. If anything, I leaned in harder, cooking dinner, suggesting family movie nights, even planning a weekend outing to the zoo. She seemed relieved by my sudden attentiveness, though there was still a flicker of suspicion in her eyes. I feel like we've turned a corner, she said one night as we sat on the couch, the kids finally asleep. Maybe we have, I said, offering a small smile. She leaned against my shoulder, her warmth familiar and disorienting all at once. I let her stay there, even as my mind churned with the plans still in motion. A week after the IRS audit, Neil called again. You're not going to believe this, he said, laughing. One of David's biggest clients just jumped ship. Word is, they're spooked by the audit and don't want to get caught in the fallout. What's that mean for him? Loss of revenue, loss of reputation. It's a domino effect. Once one client pulls out, others start questioning if they're next. Good, I said, gripping the phone tighter. What about Melissa? Has she done anything unusual? Neil hesitated. She's been quieter lately. Still meeting David, but not as often. It's like she's pulling back, maybe because of everything going on with him. Keep watching, I said, my voice cold. I need to know if she's planning anything. Will do. That night, as I tucked Emily and Ryan into bed, a pang of guilt crept in. They looked so small, so innocent, their lives untouched by the chaos swirling around them. Emily clutched her favorite stuffed bunny, her eyes drooping with sleep. Daddy, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Do you love us? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. Of course I do, sweetheart, I said, brushing a hand over her hair. Why would you ask that? She shrugged, her eyes fluttering shut. You've been different lately. As I closed the door, I leaned against it, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I'd started this to protect myself, to reclaim control, but the collateral damage was becoming harder to ignore. Still, I couldn't stop now. The next morning, Melissa seemed distracted, her phone buzzing more frequently than usual. Everything all right? I asked, sliding a plate of eggs across the counter. Yeah, she said quickly, barely glancing up. Just a lot going on at work. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee, and I noticed the faint shadows under her eyes. I leaned back against the counter, watching her carefully. If there's anything you need to talk about. She forced a smile. Thanks, Alex, I'm fine. But she wasn't. I could see it in the way her shoulders sagged, the way she avoided my gaze. David's world was crumbling, and it was only a matter of time before she felt the full impact. I didn't feel sorry for her, not anymore. The mask she wore, the confident, loving wife, was starting to slip. And I'd make sure that when it fell, there'd be nothing left behind it. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Melissa sat across from me at the dining table, her eyes darting between the kids as they cleared their plates. I'd suggested a special dinner, just the two of us, once the kids were in bed. She'd agreed, though I could tell something about my sudden attentiveness unsettled her. Can we have ice cream after? Ryan asked, his voice full of hope. Not tonight, buddy. I said, ruffling his hair. "You've got school tomorrow." Emily groaned dramatically, dragging herself toward the stairs. "Fine, but only because I'm tired." Melissa smiled faintly as she watched them go. "They're getting so big," she said, her voice soft. I nodded, my chest tightening. The kids' laughter drifted down the hallway, followed by the sound of doors closing. For a moment, I hesitated, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me. Then I stood and walked to the kitchen. "Wine?" I called over my shoulder. "Sure," Melissa said, leaning back in her chair. I poured 2 glasses, steadying my hands as I carried them to the table. She accepted hers with a smile, though her eyes lingered on me a moment too long, as if trying to read my expression. "To us," I said, raising my glass. "To us," she echoed, though her voice lacked conviction. I let the silence stretch, sipping my wine and watching her over the rim of my glass. She shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tracing the stem of her glass. "Melissa," I said finally, my tone calm but firm, "there's something I need to talk to you about." Her smile faltered. "Okay, what is it?" I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "I know." Her brow furrowed. "Know what?" "About David," I said, the words sharp and cold. "About the affair. About the lies." Her face drained of color. The glass in her hand trembled, and she set it down carefully, as if afraid it might shatter. "Alex, I don't lie to me," I snapped, my voice rising. "I've seen the photos. I've read the messages. I know everything." Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "And it gets worse," I continued, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I know the kids aren't mine." Her eyes widened, tears welling as she shook her head. "Alex, I don't," I said, slamming my hand on the table. The wine glasses rattled, the sound echoing in the room. "You don't get to explain. You don't get to twist this into something it's not." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she reached for me, her voice trembling. "Please, let me." "I trusted you," I said, my voice low and venomous. "I built a life with you, gave you everything I had. And this is how you repay me." She broke then, sobbing into her hands. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she choked out. "It was a mistake. A mistake." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "Years of lies, of betrayal. That's not a mistake, Melissa. That's a choice." She shook her head, her sobs racking her body. "I love you, Alex. I never stopped loving you." "Love?" I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. "Is that what this is? Because it doesn't feel like love to me." Her cries quieted, and she wiped at her face, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you going to do?" I stood, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, my voice steady. "And I'm taking everything I can. The house, the money. You'll get nothing from me." Her face crumpled, but I didn't stop. "And the kids?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What about them?" I hesitated, the question hanging heavy in the air. For a moment, I saw Emily and Ryan's faces, their laughter, their trust. "They'll stay with you," I said finally, the words bitter on my tongue. "But I won't be paying for children who aren't mine." Melissa's sobs started again, but I was already walking toward the door. I paused, my hand on the frame, and turned back to her. "You made your choices," I said, my voice cold. "Now you get to live with them." And with that, I left the room, her cries echoing behind me. The house felt quieter the next morning. Melissa moved around like a ghost, her eyes red and puffy from the night before. She barely spoke as she made breakfast for the kids, her movements mechanical. I watched her from the corner of the kitchen, my coffee cooling in my hands. Emily and Ryan didn't seem to notice. They chatted about a school project, arguing over who got to present first. Their innocence cut deeper than any argument Melissa and I could have. They had no idea their world was about to change forever. "I'll drive them today," I said abruptly. Melissa flinched, as if I'd startled her. You don't have to. I want to. She nodded, her voice hollow. Okay. The kids cheered, oblivious to the tension crackling in the air. I ruffled Ryan's hair and kissed Emily's forehead before ushering them out the door. Melissa stayed behind, standing frozen in the kitchen. As I buckled the kids into the car, Emily asked, "Daddy, is Mommy okay?" She looked sad. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "She's just tired, sweetheart. Don't worry about it." Ryan piped up from the back. "Are you two mad at each other?" I forced a smile as I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements, but it's nothing for you to worry about. They seemed satisfied with that, returning to their chatter about their school project. I focused on the road, my mind racing ahead to what the day would bring. After dropping them off, I drove to John's office. The receptionist barely glanced at me as I walked past her desk and into his room. He looked up from his laptop, a cup of coffee in one hand. "You look like hell," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "Thanks for the vote of confidence." I dropped into the chair across from him. "It's done. She knows." John set his coffee down, his expression sobering. "How'd she take it?" "Not well." I leaned back, running a hand over my face. "She cried, begged, told me she still loves me." "And what about you? How are you holding up?" I hesitated, staring at the stack of papers on his desk. "I don't know. Angry. Numb. Tired. All of it." John nodded, leaning forward. "Well, the next steps are going to be hard, Alex. I won't lie to you. You're contesting child support based on the DNA results, right?" "Yes. I'm not paying for kids who aren't mine." John's gaze was steady. "You know the court might not see it that way. You've been their father for years. The judge could rule that your relationship with them takes precedence over biology." I clenched my jaw. "I've thought about that. But I'm not backing down." "All right," John said, pulling a folder from his desk. "We'll file the papers today. Divorce on grounds of infidelity. We'll include the DNA results and the financial evidence you've gathered. She'll fight. Alex, be ready for that." "I am." He handed me a pen. "Sign here, and I'll get everything started." I stared at the document for a moment, the weight of it settling on my shoulders. Then I signed my name. When I got home, Melissa was sitting on the couch, her face pale. She glanced up when I walked in, her eyes wide and full of dread. "Did you file?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes." I set my keys on the counter, avoiding her gaze. "John's taking care of it." She pressed her hands to her mouth, tears spilling over. "Alex, please. Don't do this. We can fix it. We can go to therapy, work through it." "There's nothing to work through," I said coldly. "You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." Her hands fell to her lap, and she stared at me, her expression a mixture of despair and disbelief. "What about the kids? What about us?" I leaned against the counter, my arms crossed. "The kids will stay with you. I'll still see them, but I won't be paying for children that aren't mine. As for us, there is no us, Melissa. Not anymore." She flinched like I'd struck her, her sobs quiet and broken. I felt a flicker of something. Regret, maybe, but I shoved it down. I turned and walked toward my office, shutting the door behind me. I needed to focus on the next steps. There was no room for pity now. Over the next few days, the fallout began. Melissa withdrew into herself, barely speaking except to the kids. I watched her closely, waiting for the fight I knew was coming. She wasn't the type to go down quietly. The kids sensed the tension, their questions growing more pointed. I deflected as best I could, but I knew it wouldn't hold forever. Meanwhile, I stayed in contact with John, monitoring the progress of the divorce proceedings. Every step felt like a battle, but I was determined to come out on top. David's troubles were mounting too. Neil informed me that 2 more of his clients had pulled out, spooked by the IRS audit and whispers of scandal. His business was teetering on the edge, and I couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. But as I sat in my office one night, staring at the paperwork spread across my desk, I couldn't shake the nagging thought that this was only the beginning. The fallout wasn't over yet, and the storm was far from done raging. The cracks in David's empire were spreading faster than I'd anticipated. Neil called me that morning with the latest update, his voice brimming with amusement. "Your boy's having a rough week," he said. "The IRS audit. Turns out they found more than they expected. A couple of offshore accounts tied to unreported income. Nothing criminal yet, but enough to raise flags. His competitors are eating it up." I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window. And his clients, jumping ship left and right. He lost another big one yesterday. Word is, his biggest investor is considering pulling out. That got my attention. The investor, do we have a name? Yeah, Robert Kramer. Owns half the real estate downtown. The guy's a shark, and he doesn't like instability. I smirked. Let's make sure he doesn't like David anymore, either. Already ahead of you, Neil said. I've got a contact who can nudge Kramer in the right direction. I hung up, a sense of satisfaction settling over me. David was crumbling. And I wasn't done yet. That evening, Melissa sat at the dining table, absently stirring her tea. She hadn't looked me in the eye since the night of the confrontation. The once vibrant spark in her was gone, replaced by something dull and heavy. I didn't feel sorry for her. Not anymore. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral as I set my laptop on the counter. She glanced up, startled, as if she'd forgotten I was there. "Yeah, work's been overwhelming." I nodded, sipping my water. "You hear from David lately?" Her face froze for a fraction of a second, then she shook her head. "No." "Why?" I shrugged. "Just curious. I've been hearing some things about his business. Doesn't sound good." Her hands tightened around the mug, her knuckles white. I wouldn't know. I let the silence stretch, watching her squirm under my gaze. She was unraveling, and it showed. "Well," I said finally, "if you do hear from him, maybe let him know I'm thinking of him." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. For a moment, I thought she might say something, but she didn't. She simply stood and walked out of the room, her tea untouched. The next day, Neil called with another update. Kramer pulled his investment. It's official. I couldn't help but smile. "What's that mean for David?" "It means he's bleeding out," Neil said. "Without Kramer, his company can't survive. Expect bankruptcy within a month, maybe less. And personally, hard to say. His reputation's taking a hit, but he's not out of the game yet. Guys like him always find a way to slither back." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. "Not this time. I want him done. No second chances." Neil chuckled. "Understood." The fallout hit Melissa like a tidal wave. I came home that evening to find her sitting on the couch, her phone clutched in her hands. She looked up as I entered, her face pale. "Alex," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to talk to you." I set my bag down and crossed my arms. "Go on." "It's David," she said, her voice cracking. "His business is collapsing. He called me, begging for help. But there's nothing I can do." Her tears spilled over, and for the first time in weeks, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. "What am I supposed to do?" "Everything's falling apart." I stared at her, my expression cold. "You made your bed, Melissa. Now you get to lie in it." She flinched at the venom in my voice, her sobs growing louder. "I never meant for this to happen. I was stupid, Alex. I was selfish. But I never wanted this." "Didn't you?" I asked, stepping closer. "You threw away our life. You betrayed me, our family. For what? For him." She shook her head, her hands trembling. "I was lost. I didn't." "Stop." My voice was sharp, cutting through her excuses. "I don't care why you did it. All I care about is what happens now. And right now, you're reaping exactly what you sowed." Her sobs quieted, and she looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "What happens to us?" "There is no us, Melissa. I made that clear." She nodded slowly, her shoulders sagging. "And the kids?" "The kids stay with you," I said, my voice firm. "I'll see them, but you're the one who gets to explain why their family fell apart." Her face crumpled again, and she buried her head in her hands. I watched her for a moment, the woman I'd once loved reduced to a broken shell. Then I turned and walked out of the room. David's company declared bankruptcy a week later. The news was all over the business blogs and local papers, how the once golden CEO had fallen from grace. I read the headlines with grim satisfaction, my plans unfolding exactly as I'd intended. But as I sat in my office, the kids laughing faintly from the other room, a flicker of doubt crept in. I'd destroyed David, dismantled his empire piece by piece. Melissa's betrayal had been laid bare, yet the hollow ache in my chest remained. Revenge had been my purpose for so long, but now that it was within reach, I couldn't help but wonder, what came next? The house felt heavier with each passing day. Melissa moved through it like a ghost, her face pale, her words clipped and hollow. The kids were starting to notice, their questions becoming harder to dodge. I knew I couldn't stay much longer. By the end of the week, the papers were filed. The divorce was official, pending the court's decision on custody and child support. I'd taken steps to protect my finances, and John assured me I was in a strong position. Still, leaving the house, the kids, felt like a weight pressing on my chest. The day I moved out, it rained. Not the soft, cleansing kind, but a cold, relentless downpour that soaked me as I loaded the last of my boxes into the car. Melissa stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, tears streaming silently down her face. She didn't say a word, and neither did I. Emily and Ryan clung to me as I said goodbye, their voices trembling. "Daddy, do you have to go?" Emily asked, her eyes wide and brimming with tears. I knelt in front of her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "For now, sweetheart, but I'll see you all the time. I promise." Ryan sniffled, his dinosaur clutched tightly in his hands. "We'll miss you." "I'll miss you too," I said, my throat tight. "More than anything." When I finally pulled away from the curb, Melissa's figure blurred in the rearview mirror, her silhouette fading into the gray of the rain. The new apartment was small, a far cry from the suburban house I'd called home for years. But it was mine. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse, but it felt like a clean slate, a place to start over. I unpacked slowly, each item a reminder of the life I was leaving behind. A family photo went into a drawer, out of sight, but not quite out of mind. The kids' drawings, which I couldn't bear to leave behind, were pinned to the fridge. Little pieces of them, even here. That first night, I sat on the balcony with a glass of scotch, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and damp. For the first time in weeks, the silence felt less like a weight and more like a reprieve. I wasn't sure what came next, but I knew one thing. This was the beginning of something new. The following weekend, I had the kids for the first time. We spent the day at the zoo, just like they'd been asking for. Emily clung to my hand, pointing out every animal she thought was cute, while Ryan ran ahead, shouting about dinosaurs even when there were none in sight. It was the first time in a while I'd seen them laugh so freely, and for a few hours, I felt lighter too. "Your place is smaller than the old house," Emily said that evening as she helped me set up the futon for her and Ryan. "But it's nice. It feels cozy." "Yeah," Ryan chimed in, his dinosaur tucked under his arm. "And you have cool stuff. Like that balcony." I smiled, tucking the blanket around them. "I'm glad you like it. You guys can come here whenever you want." "Promise?" Emily asked, her voice soft. "Promise." As they drifted off to sleep, I sat nearby, watching them. For all the chaos and anger that had filled the past few weeks, They were still my anchor, my reason to keep moving forward. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Between work, the kids, and finalizing the divorce, I had little time to dwell on the past. Melissa and I communicated only when necessary, our conversations clipped and civil. She looked more tired each time I saw her, her once polished exterior cracking under the weight of everything she'd lost. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, but I couldn't. Not yet. One evening, as I walked through the neighborhood, I stopped by a small cafe on the corner. It was quiet, the kind of place you could lose yourself in for an hour or two. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. That's when I noticed her. She was sitting a few tables away, a book in one hand, a steaming cup of tea in the other. She looked up briefly, catching my eye, and offered a small smile. It wasn't flirtatious, just kind, like she saw something in my expression and wanted to soften it. For the first time in weeks, I felt something stir. Not hope, exactly, but the faintest flicker of warmth. A reminder that the world outside my pain still existed. I nodded back, then returned to my coffee, unsure if I was ready for anything more than this quiet moment of recognition. But as I left the cafe, I realized I hadn't thought about Melissa or David for hours. And that, I decided, was progress. The email was short and direct, sent from an anonymous account I'd created weeks ago. It contained enough details to make the recipient pause, question, and most importantly, act. It was the final strike against what remained of David's reputation. The recipient was a journalist for the city's business section, someone with a reputation for exposing corporate corruption. I attached Neil's findings: questionable contracts, shell companies, and the IRS audit results. The email ended with a single line: follow the money. It all leads to David Carlisle. I hit send and leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of finality settle in my chest. David's company was already bankrupt, his empire in ruins. But reputation, that was personal. If he thought he could escape with even a shred of dignity, I wasn't done. Neil called me later that afternoon. Your timing's impeccable, he said. That journalist you tipped off, they're already on it. I've seen her work. She's relentless. David won't know what hit him. And his personal life? I asked, pacing the length of my office. Worse than we thought, Neil said. His bankruptcy has left him under investigation for mismanaging investor funds. His accounts are frozen, and he's scrambling to liquidate what little he has left to pay legal fees. Good, I said, my voice cold. He's not walking away from this. Neil chuckled. You've already won, Alex. The guy's finished. But this... He paused. This is overkill. Maybe, I admitted, but I want him to feel it. Every inch of the fall. Neil didn't argue. You'll get it. The journalist is putting together a piece now. Should hit the news cycle by the weekend. I hung up, the edges of my anger sharpening into something colder. David's company might have been bankrupt, but there was still a part of him left untouched. That part, the image of the Golden Boy CEO, was my next target. The article dropped on Saturday morning, a damning expose of David Carlisle's meteoric rise and catastrophic fall. The journalist had dug deep, connecting every dot Neil and I had unearthed. Mismanagement of funds, questionable business practices, ties to IRS-audited companies. The headline said it all. David Carlisle, a legacy of lies. By noon, the story was trending, shared widely across social media, and picked up by other outlets. Former investors gave scathing interviews. Anonymous employees described a toxic workplace culture and underhanded dealings. David wasn't just a failed businessman now. He was a pariah. Melissa confronted me that evening. She stood in the doorway of my apartment, pale and trembling, her hands clenched into fists. "Did you do this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "The article, the investigation. Is this you?" I took my time answering, crossing my arms as I leaned against the wall. "What if it is?" Her face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. You've destroyed him, Alex. Was that really necessary? Wasn't it enough to ruin the company? No, I said, my tone flat. It wasn't. Not after everything he took from me. She stepped forward, her voice desperate. This isn't just about him. It's about us, the kids. They'll grow up hearing about this, seeing it everywhere. Don't you care about that? I let her words hang in the air for a moment. I care about what he did to me, to our family. And as for the kids, that's on you, Melissa. You brought him into our lives. Her sobs broke free then, harsh and loud. I watched her, unmoved, as she covered her face with her hands. Go home, I said finally, my voice like stone. Whatever's left of it. She looked at me, her tears streaking down her face, but I turned away. The sound of the door closing behind her felt like an exclamation point. A week later, Neil confirmed the fallout was complete. David's not coming back from this, he said over the phone. No one's touching him. Not investors, not banks, not clients. He's radioactive. And personally. He's filed for personal bankruptcy now, too. Lost his car, his condo, even his private accounts. Guy's got nothing left. I nodded, a grim satisfaction settling in my chest. Good. Neil paused, his tone softening. So, what's next for you? The question hung in the air, one I wasn't ready to answer. I don't know, I admitted. But at least this part is done. Neil didn't press. Well, if you ever need another cleanup job, you know where to find me. I ended the call and sat in the quiet of my apartment, staring at the city lights beyond the window. David was finished. Melissa's world was in ruins. The revenge I'd so meticulously planned was complete. And yet, as the silence pressed in, I realized I wasn't sure what to do with myself anymore. The final confrontation with David was almost anticlimactic. By the time I saw him in person, he wasn't the confident, polished CEO I'd seen in Neil's photos. He was thinner, his suit ill-fitting, and his face lined with stress. The spark of arrogance that Melissa had clearly found irresistible was gone, replaced by a desperation that clung to him like a bad scent. We met in a quiet corner of a downtown cafe, not by accident. I'd orchestrated the meeting through a mutual acquaintance who knew just enough about David's predicament to convince him it was worth his time to see me. He needed help, and desperation makes people blind to traps. David arrived late, his shoulders hunched and his gaze darting around the room. When his eyes landed on me, there was a flicker of recognition, followed by a wariness that made me smile. David, I said, gesturing to the seat across from me. Thanks for coming. He sat down cautiously, his hands clasped tightly together on the table. What is this about? I leaned forward, my voice low and calm. This is about choices. Yours, specifically. He blinked, confused, before his expression hardened. If you're here to gloat, don't bother. I've already lost everything. My company, my assets, everything. So congratulations, Alex. You've won. I chuckled softly, shaking my head. David, you misunderstand. This isn't about winning. It's about making sure you understand exactly why you lost. His jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. You see, I continued, swirling the coffee in my mug. You didn't just mess with my marriage. You didn't just sleep with my wife. You built an empire on lies, on manipulation, on taking from others without consequence. And now you're paying for it. David's face flushed with anger, but he stayed silent, his hands curling into fists on the table. You thought you were untouchable, I said, my voice dropping further. That your charm and your money could shield you from anything. But you forgot one important thing. No empire stands forever. Not when it's built on sand. He finally spoke, his voice tight with anger. You think this makes you better than me. Smarter. You're just a bitter man with too much time on his hands. I smiled, the expression cold. Maybe. But I'm also the man who dismantled everything you've ever worked for. and I want you to remember that." David pushed his chair back abruptly, standing with a sneer. "Enjoy your victory, Alex. You won't have anything left either when this is all over." I tilted my head, unfazed. "Oh, but that's where you're wrong. I've already started rebuilding. You'll be lucky to rebuild anything." He turned and stormed out of the cafe, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The court decision came a week later. I sat across from John in the courtroom, Melissa at the opposite table with her lawyer. She looked pale and tired, her hair pulled back in a severe bun that only made the hollowness in her face more obvious. She avoided my gaze, keeping her focus on the judge. When the verdict was delivered, I barely reacted, though my heart pounded in my chest. The court finds sufficient evidence to release Mr. Hall from child support obligations based on the DNA results provided. Custody of the children will remain with Mrs. Hall, with visitation rights granted to Mr. Hall as outlined. Melissa's lawyer stood, her voice sharp. "Your Honor, we'd like to contest the financial division of assets. My client believes. Your client's request is denied," the judge said firmly. "Mr. Hall's financial evidence is clear and compelling. The division of assets will remain as outlined." Melissa's head dropped, and I caught a faint, choked sob as the judge dismissed us. It was over. That night, I sat on my balcony, a glass of scotch in hand. The city lights stretched out before me, bright and unyielding. I'd destroyed David. I'd taken back control of my life. But the satisfaction I'd once thought would follow felt strangely hollow now. The anger was gone, leaving behind a void I wasn't sure how to fill. As I stared out at the city, I let the silence wash over me, the weight of the past weeks finally settling into place. It was over. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.